Great. So as mentioned, now we are jumping to the last, but definitely not least presentation in the stage. That's going to be about trends and opportunities on combining AI and brain-machine interfacing. We will hear a presentation from Dr. Ricardo Chavarriaga, head at Clear Office Zurich and research associate at Center for Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Ricardo is a researcher and a public speaker in artificial intelligence, neurotechnologies, human-machine interaction, and responsible innovation. He is focused on understanding neural correlates of cognition and conception of meaningful tools for human-machine interaction. Dr. Ricardo is passionate about responsible development and social implications of technology. So welcome, Ricardo, to Lithuania, to our virtual stage.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hello, Ricardo. So how are you today? The final presentation, closing the track. Did you get a chance to have a sneak peek of what other speakers were talking about?
Yes, indeed. I had a very nice, enjoy very much the presentation on AI and media. And I think it's also, there are several topics that we see here. And as we were going to talk about brain-machine interfaces, on how the development of these technologies is not only on the realm of research laboratories, but on the interaction with the private sector and businesses.
Great. So let's hear it from you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining here. I'm Ricardo Chavarriaga, and I'm going to share some thoughts on the topic of brain-machine interfacing and artificial intelligence. How can we use these systems to blend artificial and biological intelligence and provide means for interacting with the environment using our brain activity? I work with the CLARE network on artificial intelligence. I lead the office in Switzerland, and we try to promote our research and development of human-centered AI. I'm also a researcher at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, and I worked with IEEE on responsible innovation and standardization of both artificial intelligence and neurotechnologies. And before entering into discussing the technologies, let's see how these technologies have been motivated, what have been the driving forces on creating these systems. So we cannot understate the cost that mental health has in society. We have an increasing amount of people having some sort of mental health issue of different levels in all across the world. And there is a need for better understanding of how the cognitive processes are implemented, on how can they be treated, to find new ways for knowing more about the human brain and ways to improve our quality of life regarding mental health. Last decade was named the decade of the brain, with many activities trying to better understanding this wonderful organ that each of us have in our heads, and that is the crux of our intelligence. Putting in terms of numbers, we can see that to take some examples, about 30 million people live with Alzheimer's disease. Up to 30% of people who have a cerebrovascular accident end up having limited motor recovery. And in Europe, the costs a decade ago of mental illnesses was about 600 billion euros. And this number is expected to grow up to 6 trillion in the coming years. So this is one of the main challenges that we have in society, and finding ways in which technology can help in overcoming this challenge is one of the priorities that some of us have in our research and our professional activities. So what are brain-machine interfaces? In short, we are talking about technologies that allows us to measure, to interpret, and to modulate the neural activity from our brain, and allows us to create a loop a communication loop between the human and machine. And for that, we can use the technologies like the ones I'm showing here, electrodes that are placed on the surface of the head or inside our body to measure the activity of our brain, to then take these signals and using artificial intelligence algorithms trying to infer the intentions of the person in order to provide a particular service that can be on the clinical domain, thinking about assistive technologies, thinking about rehabilitation processes. It can be in the consumer technology where we have, for instance, in gaming, in marketing, and in interaction with autonomous cars, or also as well in military applications, as these technologies allows us to have more information about the user, what are the preferences, the internal state, and eventually to adapt the machines that we use. And this can be our game controllers, it can be our prosthetic device, our car, our prosthesis, or any other. And thus will allow the machine to get information about the human and then adapt to the characteristics of the person, and that way create a more successful and more performant interaction with the machines that we have in our society as technology starts to play a bigger role in our lives. So some examples more specifically, we can think about restoring motor capabilities by using a prosthetic device that is controlled directly by the activity of the brain in the same way that we control our arms, by restoring sensory feedback by using algorithms to create signals that can mimic the signals that are typically seen in our nerves and go to our brain to represent the different stimuli that we can see in our lives. We can use it for rehabilitation. In this way, we can try to reconstruct in an artificial way the communication between the brain and the body, and it can be after a spinal cord injury, after cerebrovascular accidents, in order to reestablish this communication with our own body. Or it can also be used for enhancement, and there are several studies that show some evidence that using electrical stimulation in our brain can have some effect in cognitive capabilities such as level of attentions or memory. To what extent these effects are general to different populations, to what extent they last over time is a matter of a study right now. But of course, these type of applications generate a huge interest from different organizations across the world. Here are some examples of organizations, both on the public and the private domain, that are investing resources and efforts on creating different types of brain-machine interfaces. And at the core of these technologies, we always have the processing of activity from the brain by the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence methods. So as I said, the whole idea is to establish this closed loop, having the possibility to measure the activity of the brain, to know what the person wants to do, for instance, to move the prosthetic device in a particular direction, to move a cursor or another system, and then to provide feedback so that the person can really control what's going on. And all this by the use of different technologies. These are some examples you can see in the videos of the research at different stages using different types of systems about what can be done today with different types of technologies, ranging from, as I said, electrodes that are on the surface of our head to electrodes that are actually implanted inside our brains. But when we think about how do we build this brain-machine interface, what we will have is some systems to measure the activity of the brain. Here we can see examples of the technologies that are currently available, ranging from electroencephalogram, which is a technology that is more than 100 years old and is already established, all the way to systems like implanted electrodes or implanted stents that have sensors, which are only at an early stage of development. Some of them are only at a stage where they just started clinical trials with human subjects. So we are in between established and emerging technologies. And these systems can then provide us the signals that can be used using different types of methods. We see that in artificial intelligence, is a very dynamic field where we have new algorithms coming on a periodic basis, and the researchers in the domain are trying to estimate what are the best ways to process the data that we can acquire in the brain, and how can we use it in a reliable, safe, and responsible manner. And here is one of the main challenges that we have right now, and where the intersection between the research in neurotechnologies and the research in artificial intelligence is having the greatest potential and the most dynamisms. And once we have the information that tells what is the state of this person, what are the intentions of this person, we can then link it to an actuation device. And here we can use systems that are on augmented or virtual reality. We can have exoskeletons, robotic prosthetics, neurostimulation for sensory feedback, or stimulation at the level of the brain for different applications. And as I previously said, we have an intersection with artificial intelligence, but we also have intersection with other emerging technologies like advanced robotics, new materials, artificial, augmented and virtual reality, Internet of Things, so that we can have these different applications that are now starting to leave the research laboratories and being tested in commercial applications and in the private sector. And here we have a mix of applications that are in the clinical domain, which are rather regulated domain, and applications that are in the consumer domain that are targeting a wider population in less regulated areas. And this is one of the important aspects of the current trends in neurotechnologies and artificial intelligence, is the coexistence of methods, of tools that can potentially be used in both these highly regulated and less regulated fields as the clinical and the consumer technology, respectively. And the possibility of creating these models and the possibility of controlling these devices using the signals measured from the brain goes, of course, through the management of data. So this is data that needs to be stored in order to build the models, and this can potentially be data that is collected from different users or from a particular device or platform that needs to be shared in certain cases and needs to produce models that can be used for that for the different users. So we have, on one hand, a possibility of collecting data from a collective group of people that may lead to the generations of personalized models. And here is one intersection with other very active field in artificial intelligence, which is personalized medicine. How can we safely collect data from a population without creating breaches of privacy, and also with respecting the existing legislation about data protection at an international level? And that's another of the important topics that are being developed right now, and where discussions both at the technical and regulatory level are undergoing at this stage. So we see that when we talk about neurotechnologies, is in reality, we're talking about the combination of multiple technologies and also a great diversity of technological solutions and applications, and hence the end users. And it's very important for people who wants to to create companies and create products on these technologies to be very clear about what is the target population that they are aiming at, and what are the characteristics of that particular market, and the appropriate technologies that are suitable for that specific target population. So let's give a few examples of these systems. And one of them is this idea of bypassing the nervous system. We can imagine a person that has a lesion in his peripheral nervous system, for instance, a spinal cord injury, so that the signals that are generated in the brain can no longer reach the certain parts of the body. So what we can do in these cases is to measure the activity of the brain that encodes the intention of movement, use an algorithm that identifies that this person wants to extend the arm or to open the hand, and based on that information, generate a stimulation pattern that will make the muscles move in the intended way. And this is something that we can do already. These are two examples using implanted electrodes in the brain, and stimulation electrodes on the left-hand side. They are at the surface. On the right-hand side, we have electrodes that are implanted on the nerves. So in real time, we are using artificial intelligence to decode the activity of the neurons to identify whether a person wants to open the hand, perform a particular grasping type, and then stimulating the muscles in the arm to generate that pattern of movement, and hence creating this bypass across the nervous system. We can use a similar approach as well for locomotion. And this is an example where electrodes are implanted in the spinal cord, and we generate a stimulation pattern that mimics the signals that we typically have at the spinal cord that generates the rhythmic patterns of locomotion. And this is research that is being done here in Switzerland that allows to generate this pattern of locomotion, and in combination with other re-education therapies, they can promote the recovery of locomotion pattern in certain types of individuals who had spinal cord injury. So we can not only bypass the nervous system, but also help in the reparation of the nervous system of certain individuals and certain profiles. And in this example, the stimulation pattern is generated artificially and calibrated in something that is known that generates the stimulation that leads to the locomotion. But we can also then use electrodes in the brain to decode the intention of walking, the type of walk, the speed, and then use that to generate spinal stimulation to generate the locomotion pattern. These are examples with the primate model for these type of lesions, and research is going on to then move on towards tests and clinical trials with human subjects as well. In these examples that I have shown so far, what we have is systems where we take we use artificial intelligence to create a model of the brain activity for different particular actions or mental tasks. So you use it as a decoder of the neural activity. Another possibility is to use artificial intelligence for human-machine collaboration. And we all know that in fields such as autonomous vehicles, we can already create very high-performant mobility platforms, certain vehicles such as cars, transportation shuttles, wheelchairs. So in this case, what we can have is to develop semi-autonomous systems that will take the general information about the intention of mobility from the user, while the low-level actions are decided autonomously by the wheelchair in this case, or by the mobile platform. So we will distribute the task between the human and the machine, and the role of the artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms in this case is to understand the scene, to identify, for instance, obstacles and ways that are empty, and to use that information and fuse it with the information that comes from the brain on the intention, where does this person wants to go in order to make a decision. And these are platforms that can be used in different elements. In this case, we see one example of an event that is called a cybathlon, where users are trying to control these game characters, and they use their mental activity to select which of the different actions the character should do. So we use artificial intelligence to identify these different actions and to send the information to the character here in the game. And one interesting thing that we see in this, we saw in this experiment, this was done while I was at EPFL a few years ago, is that the activity of the brain changes as they interact with the machine. And what you see here in these blue circles is the strength of the activity of the brain of this person when it was trying to send different commands. The more yellow the pattern is, means that when he sends different commands, they are more different than when it's blue. And when this person first started to use the machine and to interact with the machine, it had certain differences between the different commands, but as long as it kept training and using the artificial intelligence systems to decode the activity, the person also adapts himself and creates a strategy that makes it easier for the machine to understand his commands. And it's similar to when we get trained in a particular skill. So we can use artificial intelligence to provide human-machine co-adaptation. We can create algorithms that detect changes in the pattern of activity in the human, and then that can provide feedback that helps in the training of what does the person needs to do to generate a particular effect, in this case, in this example, corresponding to the video game. And another case, as we have here with the mobile platform, is that we use this technology. It's a standard electroencephalography that provides us information about the activity in the motor cortex. We use a machine learning algorithm to decode whether the user wants to move towards the left or towards the right. And then the platform, using video, detects the obstacles and decides in which direction to move. We also did some experiments with semi-autonomous cars where we were measuring the level of anticipation, level of attention, and processing of errors in the driver to provide that information to the autonomous car and be able to adapt its behavior according to that. And one last example of how can we use artificial intelligence to promote better human-machine interaction is to use it for mutual learning. So I showed before that by interacting with an autonomous machine, humans can change their mental activity to better match what the system is doing. And this is one of the nice things about a closed loop. And here, what we are using is trying to make the human teach the machine about what it should do. And in this particular case, we are using reinforcement learning paradigm and taking advantage that there are signals in the brain that tells us when the person makes an error or when it detects an error in the interaction. So in this example, the person can interact with an artificial device, a robotic arm, or a computer platform. And whenever it sees an error, we can detect these signals and use it as a negative reward to the controller of the artificial system to tell that that wasn't the correct action to do at that particular stage. So, and by doing so, the artificial system can gather information about what the task is, and more importantly, what are the preferences of the user on how it should behave. And we use this type of signals in one application for a typewriting application for people who are completely paralyzed. And in this application, we have a cursor that moves across the different characters. And whenever it moves towards the correct character, the person agrees, so we don't have the signal. But when it moves away, we have this signal in the brain and tells us this is not the right direction. We can provide that to our typewriting application as a negative reward. And by using reinforcement learning, we can then infer what is the appropriate character to write. And on top of that, we can also put language models and have a prediction or an estimation of what are the most likely characters to be written based on what has been written before. And with that, we can speed up the typewriting speed. So here is an example where we'll use different techniques of artificial intelligence to promote the human-machine interaction. We have one machine learning algorithm that decodes the activity of the brain to identify when the person sees an error in the interaction. We have a reinforcement learning algorithm that infers what is the most likely character to be written. And we have a language model that allows us to give prior probabilities to the different characters based on the past. And this is something that is coming more and more common in the development of brain-machine interfaces. We also used this similar approach, in this case using inverse reinforcement learning in interaction with a robot, where now the algorithm is trying to identify what is the value function of the user, what is the function that defines what does the user considers correct. And we can then apply that to teach the robot to move in the way that the person prefers. And in this case is a manipulation task over a tabletop where the robot can easily avoid collisions, but we can tune how close does the person wants to pass by the obstacles according to his own preference. And we have seen that the brain signals can tell us information about different preferences on each of the subjects and use that to teach the robot to behave accordingly. So in summary, we can use these different algorithms not only to decode the brain activity, but also to provide a human-machine teaming and also a human-machine co-adaptation in different platforms. So overall, we have seen several examples of success stories of what these systems can do, and this has generated, of course, a lot of interest from both the governments, from the private sector, from funding agencies, and from entrepreneurs. But we have to say that we are still talking about an emerging technology. Most of these systems are still at an early stage of maturity. Some of them are a proof of concept, some of them are already at a prototype level, and a smaller proportion are at a point of a minimum valuable product. But to a large extent, we are still lacking information about their performance in long-term use, given how novel these technologies are. So this is something that is required right now. There is a lack of benchmarks to compare performance in different applications, and also poor validation processes. And this is something that the community, both in the research and in private sector, should push forward to better ways to validate whether these systems are really fit for purpose. Because of course, what can possibly go wrong? And there have been several examples on multiple emerging technologies that tell us that when we deal with emerging technologies, there can be unknowns, and there can be unexpected consequences. And as such, it's very important that we try to move carefully, but in a sustained manner in the development of these technologies. And just to put some examples about the applications, making a difference between those applications that are at a mature stage, we can have deep brain stimulation and cochlear implants as systems that are commercially available today and commonly used. We have applications in neurorehabilitation and assisted neuroprosthetics that are in a good way to become more widespread adopted in the coming years. Very active efforts on research towards developing products on cognitive enhancement in military applications and performance monitoring, both for training, for management, and for marketing purposes. So, and these are some of the activities that we can see in a shorter time frame, whereas in the possible we have other ideas that enter into a more speculative way, and that also are being used to feed some of the fears in certain people that are risk of mental surveillance and the possibilities of having memory implantation. But the realization of these different technologies and different applications have to tackle challenges that we face right now, which is the poor understanding that we have of the brain, despite our advances from a neuroscience perspective. There are still a lot of unknowns in how does the brain work. And while these technologies can help to extend our knowledge, we still need move quite a while to really understand what the brain is actually doing. We also have an issue with the amount of data compared to other applications where artificial intelligence has a proven success. The amount of data that we have for developing these applications is very limited, in particularly when we talk about personalized devices. And this is very important also for people working on artificial intelligence and novel methods. How can we go from the current methods that are actually quite hungry regarding the amount of data that is required to methods that can work with more limited amount of data, that can take advantage of things like or approaches like meta learning or transfer learning in order to potentiate the possibility of having a more performant models. We also have a certain dissonance between the clinical and consumer development cycles, where we have one that moves faster than the other. How can, as technology is being shared between these two fields, how can we move ahead with these two type of development cycles, and how can we make them consistent in order to still develop the innovations that are required in a responsible way? I already mentioned that there is a lack of standardization that is important to start tackling. We have standards at the level of individual elements of the brain-machine interface system, such as the exoskeleton, the AR/VR system, or the sensor, but not so much at the systemic level. How do we evaluate? How do we specify a complete brain-machine interface? This is something that still needs to be developed, and there are several initiatives that have been launched in the last years in this way. And there is, of course, uncertainty on what will be the regulatory and the governance frameworks that will rule the development of these technologies. This is, of course, a common challenge across all artificial intelligence, but there are particularities on the use of brain data that needs to be taken into account when we want to develop and commercialize these devices at an international level. Some of these regulatory frameworks and governance frameworks will have to deal with challenges with ways to action in the promotion of innovation and the binding laws and the ethical frameworks and human rights, so that we can have, for instance, just to mention a few, complementary regulation between the consumer and the medical field, that we can have a more clear information about how can we share data both from research and from development across borders. It's something that still needs to be developed at the level of the innovation and how we develop to start adopting practices such as responsible research and innovation, to start having privacy by design when we start having systems that measure our brain activity and are potentially storing it into the cloud. How do we ensure that there is not a malicious use of this data? And as I mentioned, there are different efforts on trying to work on these elements for governance and promotion of innovation. There are some examples of organizations that are working on these areas at different levels, ranging from principles, both ethical and technical, to technical guidelines, standards, and regulation. And some of them are more on the ethics framework. Some of them are more on the innovation. Here I can mention the OECD that has already released a recommendation to its members on responsible innovation in neurotechnology at the level of standards. I have quite involved on development of standards for neurotechnologies with IEEE. At the level of CLARE, we are trying to bring together researchers and decision makers and people in the private sector to discuss strategic agendas, not only in neurotechnologies, but on different topics. Next month, we will have a strategic workshop on the use of artificial intelligence in health, where we'll try to work on these different challenges, and especially taking into account the importance that the research, but also the private sector has in developing solutions for these different elements. In overall, as in any emerging technology, we have to deal with uncertainty, and we have to be able to cope with that and to develop these technologies to evaluate the effects that they have and find ways to bring solutions while keeping the risks at bay. And that's been the main message, and there are different approaches where we can do so. I will be happy to discuss more and to listen and answer to your questions here. And again, thank you very much for your invitation today.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and we've already received some compliments for you and a question as well. So let me read it. A very interesting topic of research indeed, says our viewer Ignas. Could you please comment if the AI algorithms used to translate the impulses from the brain to the movements of the limb are the same or different for humans and apes, since the complexity of human brain and ape brain differs? What do you think about that?
Yes. There are definitely differences between the animal model and the human model. However, when we look at the specific activity of neurons in the motor cortex, the type of models are the same. Both models work similarly well. That, of course, is in part because we are focusing on a very specific process that's directly linked with the motor activity. Things may change more drastically when we try to decode higher cognitive capabilities.
And when it comes to experimenting with animals and animal brain force in general, do we face any ethic limitations on here or animal rights?
Definitely. All the research that is done in animal models is overseen very strictly by the ethical boards. It's also worth mentioning that the work with these models is now being reduced to a large extent to just very essential research, and is less and less, common now. Also, since we are starting to reach a level of maturity of some of these devices, we can as well do experimentation with the human subjects, which is of course very well framed and overseen, and in the case of implanted electrodes, is always done under a clinical setting.
And for me, it's really interesting to know more about data collection in Europe and how we go around the regulations. Maybe you can share what are the most significant limitations right now in our regulatory environment in such field.
Yeah. Well, I would say the biggest challenge right now is that often the researchers or the developers don't have a clear idea of what are the different rules that apply when they want to share data across institutions, across countries. In the funding agencies have been doing significant efforts on education, raising awareness, and also when we prepare a research project now is one of the elements that needs to be proposed is already to have a data management plan in order to ensure that the data will be collected, stored, and maintained in a reliable way, and also as long as possible following the FAIR principles. However, the situation is so complex that it's very hard to find oneself on what needs to be done. One of the current activities I am involved in with several of our colleagues is to try to identify what can be a more specific and more streamlined models for governance of brain data to not only identify something that needs to be known by researcher, but also where the risks are and what are the best ways to protect against these risks. And one of the scenarios where we are developing this is with the International Brain Initiative, which is an organization that gathers the large brain-oriented consortia across the globe, including the Human Brain Project here in Europe, the Brain Initiative in the United States, as well as similar initiatives in Canada, in Korea, in Japan, Australia, and others.
Let me read another question from the audience for you. What are the main challenges in individual patient level? For example, do the same deficiencies mean the same type of brain damage? If not, how could such inconsistencies between patients be solved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one of the main challenges is how can we produce reliable models for individual people? So in general, when we look at the cognitive process and the neural processes, there is often a common part. So in how the cortical tissue is structured and how it's linked to different parts of the body. So there are certain commonalities, but then each individual has its own pattern. And to make an analogy, most of us walk in pretty much the same way. So we just alternate our legs and we have a swing and stance phase. But when we look at the details, how long the steps are, how fast we walk, then we see a lot of differences. And this is the real challenge. So what do we do? So generally, we have a knowledge, so it's like a model-driven part of the work where we know what does the neuroscience says about this particular process. So we know, in general, where the features should lie. And this can be used as a starting point to tune and customize our models. So we identify and we select models that are able to catch particular types of variations in the activity, but then the specific patterns that correspond to this person that we need to find out. And the way it is found out right now is usually through a classic training, testing, validation process, where we first gather data, we ask the person to do the task and to try to do the task. We annotate that data, and then we try to build our model. And that's one of the reasons why we usually have less data, a very limited amount of data to build our models. And we are only starting to see how AI or machine learning techniques that require larger amounts of data, such as deep neural networks, we are still trying to figure out how this can be applied in the case of limited data that we have in these applications.
But speaking on the impact on humans, do you discuss with your colleagues or do research on the long-term applications for human brain? For example, when we use VR glasses and our children play a lot various games that stimulate their brain, does it have any do you think it will have an impact in the long term? And if so, what kind of?
Yes. Yeah, I think the potential to having an impact in long term when we use different ways of interaction is definitely there. And it's very high that we can generate long-standing changes. One example of that is how when I was showing the example of controlling the video game, how this person who trained to use this or to play this video game using the brain-machine interface for several months, we saw that he learned how to generate patterns that were easier for the machine to decode. And this is one example of this adaptation that we have. Another example is what we have in rehabilitation practice. So the time span is still short to have concrete or hard evidence of what can be the effects that this may have. I guess, as is the case with other technologies, it's not only a question of what could happen, but also how do we design the interaction mechanisms to generate the effects that we want and to avoid effects that we don't want. So to make an extreme case, if we can control everything with our mind and we no longer use our body, then we will lose physical strength. And this is probably something that we don't want. So we may need to identify what the target user is, what are the realms of application that we want, and what are the capabilities that we think should be maintained, and the contribution that the user should have when using these technologies. And that would be a way to steer these long-term effects in a way that is beneficial to the individual and has less malicious effects.
And I have one of the final questions for you. We have widely discussed where Europe stands in the global picture of developing AI solutions, and where can we conquer at least a little bit with the big ones, the US and the China, and do we just brief to their backs, or we have something to bring to the table? And here my question would be, do you see this brain-machine interfacing as one of the areas and neurosciences with AI application where we can actually give quite of a strike?
I think there is a huge potential in Europe, and in a similar way as in artificial intelligence, we have in Europe an incredible community of research at all across the different countries, at different types of institutions. So the know-how and the possibility of developing these solutions, also in combination with a rather strong ecosystem for health applications, is really a very good substrate to lead in this field. And we see that in academic research, Europe is a big player here in this field, and it has been since the beginning of the research in this aspect. As in other cases, one of the points where things become less clear on how can we lead is in the innovation processes. How can we streamline the creation and the growth of entrepreneurial efforts in these techniques? There are very good signs, and we can see all across different countries. If I think about the scene in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Switzerland, there is a very vibrant community of neurotech and enterprises that is very promising. And now we have to ensure that the environment allows them to grow in the way that they should. And it's very, very encouraging, since we are in general in fields that don't have a very clear line between the research and the development. We are still moving across this line as it is an emerging technology. And here, Europe really has the possibility to be one, if not the lead region for this. And another aspect is, and when we talk about technologies, the trust that people put in these systems is a great asset. And that's one of the cards that our innovation ecosystem can also put in to position itself as the leader.
Yeah, as it sounds not only promising, but we see the actual companies working towards that direction. For example, one of the famous Lithuanian company, Neurotechnology, accessing such issues. It's going to be interesting to see where we end up. And now I have the final question for you, which is related to the first question that you answered today. And our viewer Ignas is still impatient to know. He says, if I understand correctly, you can develop algorithm of limb movement using the animal brain and then use it directly on the human without any modification. So is that true?
So the algorithm, the technique that we use is the same, but the model, it will be specific to the person. The parameters of the model will be specific to the person, and it will be also changed from one person to the other. And there will be characteristics like where the electrode is located, what is the particular frequency and the particular feature. And the current state of the art is that we have a model per person.
Great. So I hope we got all the questions answered. And in case you have any more, I believe Ricardo would be open for further connection or collaboration. So feel free to reach out. And I would like to say a big thank you, Ricardo, for closing this bleeding edge AI application stage today with your final presentation.
Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here virtually.
Thank you.